When Pepin died, his son Charlemagne, whom I've already talked about, Charlemagne became the king of the Franks, and Charlemagne built an empire that included most of what is today France and Germany and the northern part of Italy. Charlemagne was a little cut above the people of his day. He, in an age when most men were reckless in their eating and drinking, he was moderate in both. He was very religious. He tried to rule with a firm and yet just hand. And he was widely respected, and he was remembered for hundreds and hundreds of years after he was gone. And a lot of the kings of France who came later tried to copy him, even though none of them, until Napoleon, had the empire he had. Charlemagne could neither read nor write, but he realized the value of education, because much too often he would issue an order and tell a horseman, now you tell Count so-and-so to do this and such. By the time the order came back to Charlemagne, it was altogether different what he had said. And Charlemagne finally wrote, hey, what I've got to do is have a scribe write this order down. So Charlemagne would get a scribe and tell the scribe, you write this down. Then the scribe would carry the written order to the count. And it was noticed that the order was better obeyed when it was written down. It was. In fact, if you go to a big factory today, like I spent 27 years at Lockheed, they have what's called an ANVO. The ANVO stands for Accept No Verbal Orders. In other words, only do what is written down. And again, probably most of you don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe you'll never see the inside of a factory. But ANVOs are a big part of the way factories run themselves. The boss wants something done, or if you want something, the boss to do something for you, simply write down an ANVO, ANVO. And that way there's supposedly less confusion as to what wants to be you want done. But Charlemagne found the same thing. Charlemagne ruled through counts. This is before the officers. This was the beginning like of the feudal system. He would appoint some of his top, most able men to be a count and say, you go take the county of Paris, or you go take the county of Orleans, you take the county of Aquitaine, and the county of Brittany. And France is divided into many counts and counties, and each count then was each county was headed up by a count. Charlemagne ruled through the counts. Now eventually the counts became dukes, and the dukedoms were divided into smaller and smaller units. I've already mentioned how that in the year 800 on Christmas Day, Charlemagne went down to Rome to assist the Pope. Now, folk, we do not know if Charlemagne really wanted to be crowned. All we do know is that the Pope crowned him on Christmas Day. Just asked him to kneel at a ceremony, and while he was kneeling, he slipped a crown on his head and said, "Arise, Emperor of the Romans." We don't know if Charlemagne wanted the crown. We don't know if Charlemagne liked the idea. We don't know if Charlemagne might have actually asked for the crown, but nevertheless, we do know that he was crowned in December 25th, 800. And he became the first Roman emperor who was not genuinely of Roman descent. Now, there were people living in Italy who still called themselves Roman, but none of them had been able to ascribe to the empireship until the time of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, as your book says, has been regarded as the father of Europe. All right, Charlemagne, when he passed off the scene, there was no strong ruler destined to come on the scene for a good many years. Charlemagne's empire was divided. Here was a problem that the French people had. They felt like every one of the king's sons should get a share of the throne. Well, Charlemagne himself only had one son, so the empire remained united. But that son had three sons. So when Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son, died, one son got what is today Germany, another son got what is today France, another son got the middle area between them. The older son got this area of northern Italy and what is today Switzerland, and the area between France and Germany. Well, then when these kings died, they subdivided the kingdom even farther, because each one of them gave their sons an equal cut. The idea that only one son should inherit the throne was to come later. So part of it was due to a weakness of having more than one son inherit the throne and split the kingdom. But part of it was Europe became beset by this time from on all sides. The Muslims threatened from the west and threatened from the east. The Vikings threatened from the north. And the Magyars threatened from Mongolia. I've already talked about how that wave after wave of Mongolians have come in, and Europe looked like might not survive. Well, Europeans being resourceful, they did survive. Eventually they converted the Northmen, the Vikings, to Christianity, and they settled. The Magyars were converted to Christianity, and they settled here in this region of Romania and Austria-Hungary. Bulgaria settled in here. However, the Muslims never did convert. And the fight between Europeans and Muslims is still going on to this day. It's gone on off and on, but it's still going on. All right. World of lords and vassals, and then I'll quit. Essentially you have, and I've tried to introduce this word to you before, what came about as a result of all this turmoil was what we call the feudal system. Feudal system is where you have a nominal king, or a person who has a title of king, who is descended from other kings, and then around the king you have a bunch of nobility, but the nobility only loosely follows the king. I mean, they'll follow the king if they want to, but they don't if they don't want to. So Europe began to be ruled by the king at the top. Under the king were dukes. Under the dukes were counts. Under the counts were barons of various orders. And some society had viscounts, archdukes, princes. A prince might be a son of a king, but who did not get the throne. This became the feudal system, where they had a loosely grouped confederation. Essentially, it was the feudal system came about when the kings lost their power, and then the political power went into the hands of the nobles. And we've talked about in Japan how that for a while in Japan the central government would be powerful, then the local governments become more powerful, and the pendulum would sweep back and forth between central government on the one hand, local governments on the other. In Europe, the feudal system held sway, and the feudal system was to hold sway until the Renaissance, when kings began to reassert themselves. Or actually before that, at the time of the Crusades or thereabouts. But for hundreds of years, the most powerful people in Europe were the nobles, more so than the kings. All right. And we're going to get back to the feudal system a little bit. I mean, developing a fief holding here at the bottom of the page. But before I do, I want to mention the Vikings, and then I'll close. It is now known, proven definitely, that the Vikings crossed the Atlantic and came to North America about the year 1000, almost 500 years before Columbus. The Vikings first went to this area they called Iceland, and they settled in Iceland for a while. Then a bunch of them drifted off course and was blown up by the winds to land that they called Greenland. And some of them settled in Greenland. And then Leif Erikson, I believe, is forced to leave Greenland, and he settled in what's today Nova Scotia. We have found the ruins of his little town in Nova Scotia. Leif Erikson clashed with the Indians and lost, because at that time the Indians greatly outnumbered him. Now, 500 years later, kings and queens got involved, and the Spanish had gunpowder, the Europeans had gunpowder and heavier armor. But the Vikings, courageous though they were greatly outnumbered by the Indians. 500 years later, the numbers of the Indians had greatly diminished due to disease. But the Vikings had long told us that they had been to America long before Columbus. Today we believe them. Now, about the Vikings, they named the country they found Greenland. And a lot of persons said, oh, they were just doing an advertising ploy. Let's give it a really fancy name so people come here. Actually, folk, I believe it was named Greenland because the time was a green land. At the time that the Vikings came over, the climate was much, much warmer than it is now. I'll be talking about that later. This was a period of time called the High Middle Ages. There's a certain species of grapes that the Vikings described that they will grow no higher than the state of, no farther north than the state of New Jersey. But at that time was growing all the way up in Nova Scotia. And some of the plant, well, the Vikings were able to set up farms in Greenland just like they had in Norway and Sweden. Today, that's impossible. The Vikings, though, looked on the Eskimos as being fraying, so in other words, demons, devils, whom they would have nothing to do with. This was sad because when the cold blast hit, which it did in the 1300s, the Vikings found themselves frozen out. And when the Vikings came back 200 years later, they found the last of the people to die in the colony had died in bed, nobody around to bury them. If they had only copied from the Eskimos thrived in cold weather. They knew how to handle the cold. The Vikings did not. So the result was the Vikings all died out. And for 200 years during the Black Death, there was nobody who went from Norway to Greenland. Then 200 years later, in the 1500s, they went back only to find that their Viking colony had all died out. Anyway, your book just barely mentions them. Your book only mentions the Vikings as being a scourge to Europeans. They spread terror throughout Europe. And eventually these Northmen were to conquer England, come down here and conquer part of Italy. But that's a later story. We'll take it up next time. I'll see you on Wednesday.